We are in Parashat Ki Teitzei, and today we're going to discuss an unclear matter that is repeating 3 times in the Torah, and that is the fact that the Torah prohibits me to mix meat and dairy together. Now, if you're looking in this week's parasha, you're not going to find that prohibition. Rather, we find a different prohibition, that we can't have a mixed variety of things, whether it's shatnez, wool and linen, mixing 2 animals together, an ox and a donkey, mixing seeds. This is called isur kil'aim, a mixed variety. But in that concept also comes the basar v'chalav, the meat and dairy, which 3 times in the Torah prohibits us to do so. And needless to say, there's many unclear things in this entire topic, but Bezrat Hashem, this parasha is going to help us not only understand the mixing of the meat and the dairy, but also mixing everything and what one needs to take from that. So, before we start, always good to start the class with a little smile. So I heard a funny story, and apparently it's real, so it will be a real joke. That one time, this guy who's Torah observant, he goes on a long trip from New York to Canada, and he takes the freeway from New York all the way north to Canada, and happened to be that he didn't eat anything before he leaves. Okay, so he's driving, and sure enough, at some point he starts becoming hungry. But he says, okay, where am I going to find something here on the highway to eat? So he's driving another hour. At some point, he's getting real hungry. He's like, what am I going to do? I'm starving. Okay, I'll stop at one of the rest areas. Maybe I'll find something there. I don't know, some fruits. I got to eat something. So he stops, and unfortunately, no fruit, no nothing. But he sees a McDonald's. He says, okay, I'm starving, I'm not going to eat. What's the big deal? Okay. So he goes and orders a burger. And the second he orders a burger, starts a thunderstorm that starts shaking the entire place. But not a regular thunderstorm, strong rain, winds. He's like, everybody's looking around, what's going on? So he starts feeling like Yonah, the prophet, Jonah, that not listening to Hashem, the storms everywhere, and it becomes worse and worse and stronger. So he understands that Hashem is angry and not approving his act. So he relates the ordering of the McDonald's with this thunderstorm. So he tells to Hashem, listen, I know you're not allowed to eat meat and dairy. And I know I'm not allowed to cook meat and dairy. I didn't know you're not allowed to order meat and dairy. So, with that said, this is one of the biggest, I don't know if to say enigma, but a very unclear prohibition in the Torah, the prohibition of meat and dairy, and all the mixed variety, what's called kil'aim, that in many cases is hard to understand. Now, the Torah in many times give us a discount and saying, listen, not everything you need to know. As we explained many times, there are 3 types of mitzvot. One of them is called Mishpatim, which is all the mitzvot, the commandments that make sense, that I would do it even if the Torah would not tell me to do. The other category is called Edut. Edut means a testimony. When we celebrate Pesach, all the mitzvot of Pesach is a testimony that we left Egypt. And like that, there are many types of mitzvot. It's called Edut. Edut is a testimony. Like Shabbat, we're celebrating Shabbat, testimony for the creation of the world, and many others. And the third category is what's called Chok. Chok, Chukim, a law. That's things that don't make sense. Red heifer, dipping in a mikveh, mixing wool and linen, mixing meat and dairy. We don't understand. There's no common sense here. But we do it. Why? Because Hashem told us to do it. And like that, there's many other mitzvot, tefillin, talit. I mean, one can really understand why we need to put on tefillin on. That's a chok. Hashem said, then we have to do it. But that's not sufficient for us. That's not how we serve the Hashem. That's not how we serve the Master of the universe. We need to understand. Now, interestingly, that specifically with meat and dairy, the Talmud says on it, this is a chidush, this is something new, this is not something that we would think of with our own common sense. Because not to steal, I would think of that with common sense. Not to commit adultery, to honor my parents, these are things that I would come up with it by myself. Or if I made a damage to you, I need to pay you. With meat and dairy, that you will never come up with it by yourself. More than that, the Talmud says that's something new. It's called a chidush, an innovation. But nevertheless, when we're focusing specifically on basar and chalav, meat and dairy, the Torah is also prohibiting us to cook the meat and dairy together. There are 3 prohibitions: eating the meat and dairy, cooking the meat and dairy, and having any type of pleasure from the cooked meat and dairy, which means I can't open a restaurant, cook meat and dairy, and sell it to non-Jews. I have a pleasure from that. I make money. It's called isur hana'ah. I'm not allowed to have any type of pleasure or benefit from that. Now, interestingly, this is different from any other thing, because one might say, okay, I'm not allowed to eat unkosher animals. I'm not allowed to eat a horse. I'm not allowed to eat a pig. There's no problem with cooking the meat of the pig. There's no prohibition. I can actually open a restaurant that I cook meat, pig meat, and sell it to non-Jews. There's no prohibition with that. The cooking the meat and dairy together, that's a prohibition. But cooking unkosher meat, no problem at all. So not only the Torah prohibits me to eating the meat and dairy, the prohibition comes in the form of the cooking of the meat and dairy. As the Torah repeats 3 times, Lo tevashel gdi b'chalev imo. Don't cook the calf in the mother's milk. But it's saying the word cook. It's not saying eat or sell. So, first of all, we have to understand that when it comes to meat and dairy, there are 3 prohibitions from the Torah: the cooking, the eating, and the benefit. What's called hana'ah, benefit or some type of pleasure. Now, this can only be found in basar and chalav, with meat and dairy. This is not can be found in other mixtures. But we have to understand here that we have an issue with what's called the ta'arovet, when you mix 2 things together. Now, in this week's parasha, we're not learning about the basar and chalav, but we're learning of all the other mixed varieties. The first one is called it's called kilaim. This is called a mixed variety, and it's broken into 3 different levels. The first one is mixing wool and linen, which that corresponds to the level in creation that is called a domem, an inanimate. Right? Because you're taking wool on one hand, linen on the other hand, and the Torah says you can't mix them together. This is called sha'atnez. The next level is from the level that is called tzomeach, vegetation. Then we can mix seeds together. And the same type of seed I'm allowed to mix. But to mix 2 types of seeds together, that I'm not allowed to do. And that corresponds to the level of vegetation, of tzomeach. The next level is already in the animal kingdom. I'm not allowed to mix animals together. Can't crossbreed animals. Even though the Torah is talking here about, I can't plow the land with an ox and a donkey together. That's a isur kilaim. Now we'll explain everything in a moment. But first I have to understand that the Torah in this week's parasha is going on all 4 levels of creation: inanimate, vegetation, animal, and human. So the inanimate, I said, this is sha'atnez, wool and linen, not allowed to mix that. And that's a serious prohibition. That's a prohibition from the Torah. I know many people doesn't even come to their mind that they are not allowed to mix wool and linen. And that can be when you buy a suit, and that can also be when you're buying sheets to your bed, because you're not allowed to sleep on it. In our days, it's not so common because wool is not such a common thing. Most of it is linen. But believe it or not, you will be able to find wool and linen. But nevertheless, even though it's not common, I'm still obligated in being aware of that and still checking my items. If I buy a suit, I have to send it to be checked. That's part of the mitzvah. Even though I know, and they tell me, don't worry, there's no shatnez there. Nevertheless, go check it. So you'll pay a few dollars, check the suit, make sure there's no wool and linen, and you're good to go, and you fulfill the positive. Well, it's not a positive mitzvah; it's a negative precept, but you fulfill the mitzvah. That corresponds to the level of inanimates. Next level is seeds. Next level, which corresponds to vegetation. Next level is animals. That can mix animals. Now, the Torah is talking about plowing a land together, but it's also talking about you can crossbreed animals. And usually it doesn't really happen, but you're not allowed to do that. And of course, the fourth level will be the humans, and that's where we mix meat and dairy, and for the benefit of me either eating it or selling it and making money. And by the way, just saying as a side note, there are many things that we as Jews not allowed to do, but I'm not prohibited in doing it and selling it to somebody that is allowed to. So here, I'm not allowed to do that. I'm not allowed to mix meat and dairy in order to sell it and make a product or a restaurant or whatever. Now comes the big question, well, what is the Torah so worried about? That I'm going to mix the meat and dairy or mix the wool and linen, and what's the big deal? I mean, can you see such a severe reaction if I mix wool and linen? Or if I put meat and dairy together, what's the big deal? I didn't kill anybody. I didn't slander somebody. Why is the Torah so worried that I'm going to mix things together? That it goes out of its way, that when it comes to meat and dairy, 3 times the Torah repeats it in the same verse, exact same verse. And then when it comes to other things but the meat and dairy, what's the big deal? Okay, so I put a donkey and an ox together. Wow, why is the Torah going out of its way? Now, if it's going out of its way, must be that there's a message behind it that is profound that the Torah wants to give over. So today, Be'ezrat Hashem will learn 2 wonderful teachings, what the Torah is trying to tell me. So the first one, which is more a simple explanation, if we go to the Talmud, specifically in Tractate Pesachim, page 44b, where it's talking about the mixing of the meat and the dairy, then the Talmud says this is a chidush. This is not something new. It's something new. This is not something that can be found prior to the giving of the Torah. And the Torah and the Gemara at that time says this is a chok. Chok means a type of a mitzvah that we can't really understand, and we still have to follow it, but we're not going to find any reason to that. Now, interestingly, on this specific prohibition, in the Midrash, not in the Midrash of our parasha, rather in the Midrash Tanchuma on Parashat Mishpatim, it says, this is the prohibition that the nations mock us for. In many cases, we found that the non-Jews, they would mock us on our tradition or how we follow the Torah. The Midrash says that's what they used to point the finger at. Well, you're not mixing meat and dairy. That's how you follow your God. And we find in many places that when different faiths try to put down Judaism or the following of the Torah, that's where they're pointing on, and that's what the Midrash points out, that this is the mitzvah that the nations laugh at us, that we don't eat pig, that what's the big deal? Not to kill, I understand, not to eat a pig. That's your faith, not to eat a certain animal. So nevertheless, that can be found in the Midrash Tanchuma in Parashat Mishpatim. But interestingly, that the first time that we are introduced to the concept of not mixing meat and dairy is in Parashat Mishpatim. Parashat Mishpatim is the parasha that's coming after Parashat Yitro. In Parashat Yitro, we receive the Torah. And next portion right after that is a portion that is called Mishpatim, where we are flooded with rules from the Torah, what I'm allowed to do, what I'm not allowed to do. If I make damage to a person, I need to reimburse them. If I did this, if I did that. Which all the laws in Parashat Mishpatim are basic laws, like I'm creating a judicial system. And basic laws between me and another person. And all these laws, they can be explained and can be understood by common sense. But in all these laws, you'll find suddenly also not allowed to mix, to cook a calf in the mother's milk. Lo techalev gdi bechalev imo. That's the first time that we find it. which all the laws are called Mishpatim, common sense, and that's the only one out of nowhere with no connection to the other. Suddenly the Torah is telling me I'm not allowed to cook meat and dairy. But nevertheless, interestingly, on that the Rambam says that even in the mitzvot that are considered a chok, meaning no common sense and I'll never understand that, even in that I can find some common sense. He says, Gam bechok yesh mishpat. Even in the law that doesn't make sense, I can still find something that will make sense to it. And you know what? We can say that almost on anything. The only thing that we really don't have any common sense or nothing is clear is in the red heifer. And even Shlomo Melech, King Solomon, the wisest man ever lived, says, I have investigated, chakarti, v'sha'alti, v'badakti, I checked, and I couldn't find anything that will make common sense. Why would the ashes of a red heifer, done in a special way, if it's sprinkled as water on a person that has impurity of that will remove the impurity? So that's really the only one that you can't explain. But all the rest of the chukim, one can give you a very good explanation that you're saying, I didn't even think about that, but it makes perfect sense. Okay, so going back to the mixing of or the cooking of the meat and the dairy, we find the same verse 3 times in the Torah. The fact that something repeats itself in the Torah, that I can understand. Many times in the Torah it says that that I have to observe Shabbat. Every time it will come in a different form. Many times the Torah says I'm not allowed to kill, but it comes in a different way. Here, it's the copy-paste. Lo tevashel gdi b'chalev imo. 3 times. 3 times, and not only that, it's repeating the exact same verse, and with the exact same message. Just for the reference, the first time is in Parashat Mishpatim, which is in the book of Shmot, chapter 23, verse 19. The second time is in Parashat Ki Teitzei, book of Shmot, chapter 34, verse 26. And the third time is in Parashat Re'eh, the book of Devarim, chapter 14, verse 21. This is the 3 times that you'll find in the Torah, Lo tevashel gdi b'chalev imo. Okay. Of course, there are many questions in the commentary, why it repeats 3 times, why the repetition. The general explanation is that there are 3 prohibitions. 3 times it repeats, 3 prohibitions. I'm not allowed to cook, I'm not allowed to eat, and I'm not allowed to have any type of benefit from the cooking of the meat and the dairy. Now, Chazal, our sages, explained, and not only that, elaborated and added on that all the rest of the prohibitions. The Torah tells me I'm not allowed to cook. Because hypothetically, if I will take now a piece of meat and will throw in it milk, and eat it, then I didn't transgress the prohibition from the Torah. The transgression from the Torah is cooking it together. Right? I didn't cook it together, I just threw the milk on the meat and I ate it. But am I allowed to do that? No, because our sages already added on that all the rest of the prohibitions. The Torah doesn't give the reference that I have to wait 6 hours between meat and dairy. That's already the addition of our sages. Yeah, there's different customs. 1 hour, 3 hours, 6 hours. But nevertheless, the prohibition from the Torah is the cooking of the meat and the dairy. All the rest is from our sages, but if our sages explained to us or added or instructed us not to do certain things, there's a reason for that. And when you follow the Torah, you have to follow what our sages say exactly like the Torah, the same severity. How is that about in regards to the severity of the sin? Okay, one will be considered the Oraita from the Torah, one will be considered the Rabbanan. But nevertheless, I can't now start breaking all the fences and say I don't want to listen to the sages. Whatever the sages explain to us to do, there's a reason for that, and we follow that just exactly how we follow the Torah. But nevertheless, the Torah prohibits me of cooking the meat and the dairy, but our sages added all sorts of other prohibitions. Now will come a big question. Where did they bring that from? Why did our sages add more prohibitions? Because, first of all, we see the prohibition 3 times in the Torah. Repeating. Comes a big question. Well, 1 is not enough. Tell me once not to cook meat and dairy. I got the point. You don't need to remind me. The Torah doesn't remind me about other things. It tells me once and I got the point. Why is the Torah reminding me 3 times that I can't cook the meat and the dairy? So our sages explained that the repetition of 3 times in the Torah is to teach us about 3 prohibitions. And the cooking is in any type of a way. That's the major prohibition that the Torah is talking about. Lo tevashel gdi b'chalev imo. Don't cook the meat in the dairy. The repetition of 3 times is to come and teach me that it's corresponding to 3 types of prohibitions, and as I told you, the cooking, the eating, and the type of the benefit. But really, from the Torah, the prohibition of the meat and the dairy is only by the cooking. That's what it says, lo tevashel. Like I told you, our sages added on that many things. But nevertheless, the cooking is in any type of a way. Now, when the cooking is in any type of a way, that will include in it the eating and the benefit that I get from that. Saying, in other words, that any type of the mixing of the meat and the dairy is prohibited. So our sages had to add on that, okay, the mixing, the cooking, in this way, in that way, and so forth. And now we're definitely not going to focus just on the meat and dairy. I'm just now, because talking about that, because there's a lot what to explain on that, and where the sages got everything, and why the 6 hours, and why to do this, and why to do that. There's explanations about everything. Now we're focusing on the fact that the Torah repeats 3 times that I'm not allowed to cook the meat and the dairy. The repetition of 3 times is to make me understand and to know that there are 3 types of prohibitions: the cooking, the eating, and the benefit, the selling of it, or some type of benefit from it, hana'ah. But nevertheless, the prohibition here is the cooking. And why is that so important? We're going to understand that towards the end of the class, is by the mixing, because when you cook something together, like I told you, if I now take a sandwich and I put a piece of turkey, and then on top of that I put a piece of cheese, like a sub-sandwich, according to the Torah, that's not prohibited. I didn't cook them together, I just put them next to each other. Right? So one might say, oh, I can go to Subway now and make myself a sandwich. No, for the Americans who know what Subway is. You tell it to a South African, they'll be like, what? What's a Subway? But nevertheless, so one can say, listen, I can go now and make myself a turkey and cheese sandwich. Well, according to the Torah, that's not cooking. I just put the 2 pieces together. But nevertheless, our sages also don't allow that, and for many different reasons right now. But the point to take here is that the prohibition is the mixing together, is the cooking, and the cooking is when you mix 2 things together. Okay, with that said, I can understand that the message, the first explanation based on what's called the pshat, the simple explanation, is the mixing of the 2 things together, of the meat and the dairy. The actual cooking, not the putting them together, because I can put on the same table. I mean, that is also prohibited, by the way. If I'm eating now a meat meal and you're eating something with dairy, we can eat on the same table, but it has to be a separation and a different tablecloth, and there's different laws for that. But the simple explanation is, like I told you, 3 repetitions for 3 types of prohibitions. The prohibition from the Torah is the cooking, but nevertheless, our sages added on that many other prohibitions for many different reasons, which we're not going to explain today, and I think I actually gave in the past a few classes explaining it more thoroughly. But in order to continue, we have to understand that, a lot of people have an issue with the oral Torah. A lot of people say, I want to see what it says in the Torah, and that's what I follow. Not only non-Jews, a lot of non-Jews says what it says in the Torah, that makes sense. Oral Torah, that's an invention. But believe it or not, there are many Jews that also say that. And of course they come and they say, do what it says in the Torah, but distort everything around it. But we have to understand that the oral Torah and the written Torah is the same thing. If now the written Torah will explain every little law, then the Torah would be like a library. How you can explain the whole Torah? Hashem spoke in codes and in short messages. But nevertheless, it has to come the oral Torah and explain everything. Even something as simple as a tefillin. It doesn't even say anywhere in the Torah the word tefillin. It says totafot. So how did we derive from that it's tefillin, and it goes one on the hand and one on the head, and has to have parchments in there, and has to be square, has to be black, and where did we get all that from? That came from the oral Torah. And many other things. It's not only tefillin, it's almost anything that you'll point on in the Torah, then the oral Torah comes to explain all the rules and all the laws and why and how, when, and so forth. So Rambam, Maimonides, wrote an introduction on the Mishnah. The Rambam wrote 3 types of introductions, what's called a Hakdama. So he wrote one on the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the original, the first oral Torah. After the Mishnah came the Gemara to explain the Mishnah, and after that came the Halakha. But nevertheless, he explains in details what's called the descending chain of the oral Torah. How it evolved from the written Torah, all the generations, all the levels, everything, how it came to the written Torah. And in there he explains all these little things, like I told you with tefillin, because you're not going to find the word tefillin in the Torah anywhere. You find the word ot, and you find the word totafot. So I can take this right now and put this on my head. Who says that it has to be a black box? And that will be in everything. Slaughtering of animals and many other things that the Torah doesn't elaborate on that I have to go and figure out. It's the same thing with the mezuzah. It just says that I have to put a mezuzah on our gates. Well, what is it? How do I put it? Up, down, upside down, this side. What do I put in the mezuzah? It doesn't say in the Torah what's the mezuzah. It just says mezuzah. So on that, there's a whole explanation in the oral Torah, and the Rambam, the Maimonides, gave a whole introduction on the oral Torah, on the Mishnah, explaining everything. And in order to understand that, I'll share with you a quick story that can be found in the Talmud, Tractate Menachot, page 29, Kaftet. And it says there that when Moshe Rabbeinu went up to the Shamayim, to the heavens, then he goes all up, he's excited, he's hyped up, he's going to bring the Torah. The entire nation is waiting down next to the mountain. Everybody's waiting for the Torah. Can you imagine the excitement? He's all, nervous and like a little kid waiting, just give it to me already. And he sees the master of the universe. He sees Hashem busy. He approaches Hashem. Hashem is like, wait. I'm busy right now. Not done. Give me a few minutes. Moshe is all like, no, I get to take the Torah. Hashem says, I'm not ready. The story says that Moshe Rabbeinu sees Hashem sharpening the edges of the letters. If you notice, if you look in the Torah, some of the letters, they have what's called tagim, these little antennas. I call it an antenna. It has these little points, and some of the letters, they're like on the top of them are pointing. So it says that Moshe Rabbeinu saw Hashem like sharpening these edges. Moshe Rabbeinu, he tells Hashem, this is what you're busy with right now. We didn't even get the Torah. We don't even know how it looks. We don't know anything about it. Forget it. You don't have to be so particular. Why are you putting so much effort right now? Let us first get it. We'll start learning about it. Later on, you can teach us about these edges and why are you so particular about every little... You know that if the entire Sefer Torah, one of these edges is missing or not done the right way, the whole thing is pasul. It's part of the Torah. So Moshe Rabbeinu could not understand why Hashem is so particular. Okay, do it later. And Hashem tells him, no, that's part of the Torah, I have to finish. Okay, since Moshe Rabbeinu was very impatient, then Hashem says, okay, let me show you something. So Hashem, the master of the universe, Kol Yachol, can do anything that he wants. He takes Moshe Rabbeinu into the future and he shows him a movie about 1,000+ years after that. And he shows him Rabbi Akiva sitting on his podium, on his where his table is. All the students are sitting on the floor and he's explaining to them halachot. And it says that Rabbi Akiva doresh tilei tilim al kol ot. Rabbi Akiva pauses on every letter and explains hundreds, if not thousands of laws on every little letter and every little, little thing in the letter. And when it says kabed et avicha ve'timecha, why the word et? says kabed avicha v'imecha. A text, 2 words, 2 letters, et. And classes over classes over classes explaining hundreds of laws and angles from the Torah about every little kotz, every little point in the Torah. Wow. Moshe Rabbeinu sees that, he loses his, it says tashash kocho. Oh, wow, I didn't know the Torah is so sophisticated. I didn't know it's so, complex. On one little point in the Torah, this guy, Rabbi Akiva is teaching the students for days over days. Then in the movie, Hashem is showing Moshe Rabbeinu a movie into the future. Suddenly he sees one of the students raising his hand and telling Rabbi Akiva, objection, I don't agree with the black tefillin. What do you mean you don't agree with the black tefillin? He says, yeah, I can show you a source where you can explain that the tefillin is not black. Tefillin can be a different color. So Rabbi Akiva tells the student, I'm sorry, doesn't matter what your source is or what you can prove. The black tefillin is halacha leMoshe Sinai. It was given to Moshe Rabbeinu in Sinai. And in many times in the Torah, especially when we learn halacha, where do we find the source? It will say halacha leMoshe Sinai. Moshe Rabbeinu was taught that in Sinai, which means Moshe Rabbeinu came with this halacha directly from Hashem. So when Moshe Rabbeinu heard Rabbi Akiva telling the student, the black tefillin is halacha leMoshe Sinai, which means that Moshe Rabbeinu already got it originally in Sinai, 40 days when he was in the mountain. Moshe Rabbeinu understood that all the explanations and all the commentaries and all the variations in the Torah, it all funnels to the original, how he got it in Sinai. He understood that everything is included in what he received, because Moshe Rabbeinu received the written Torah. Just imagine the scenario. Hashem is speaking and Moshe Rabbeinu is writing, like a good student. That's how he received the Torah. And then he came and gives this over. Now when they read the Torah, they didn't understand one word. What are we supposed to do with this? Okay, now give me 40 years, I'll explain to you the entire Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu received it when he went up on the mountain. Now he had to explain everything. If you now take the Torah and you follow what it says there, A, you're not going to follow the Torah how it's supposed to be. B, you're going to be missing most of the information. So Moshe Rabbeinu understood that as with the generations and all the sages explaining everything, it all originates from what he received. Saying in other words that all the explanations and all the commentaries on all the mitzvot, it's not an invention of our sages. It's not that they sat somewhere in some great assembly and decided how to annoy us. No, it's not inventions. They just knew how to put the verses together and how to derive the information in order to give it to us. Because many people think, the oral Torah, that's an invention, or that's the rabbis invented that. So the story comes and tells us the rabbis didn't invent anything. They took the information that was originally given and explained it, dissected it, made it clear, brought out all the details, and so forth. So now we can go back to the original question that we had. What is the Torah so afraid of me mixing 2 things? What's the big deal? So I put a donkey and an ox together. Or I took 2 seeds and I put them together. I wanted to save space. Or I wore a sweater that has wool and linen. What's the big deal? Why is the Torah so afraid of? So the simple explanation, which is interesting explanation, comes from the Ramban, from Nachmanides, and he says it's about cruelty. It's cruel to cook the meat of the calf in the mother's. It's cruel. That's the milk that he was supposed to drink from. Now you cook him in it. That's cruelty. Okay, so that I can understand. But that's only meat and dairy. And how is about if I'm eating chicken? Chicken didn't eat milk. And not only that, let's say I'm cooking a cow. You wouldn't cook cow in milk. You know why? Because milk, it burns very fast. If you would put now a pot of milk and you boil it, it will boil very fast. If you put a piece of meat in it, by the time the meat will start warming up, the milk will already burn. That's one of the many reasons why the Torah is using the term lo tevashel gdi bechalev imo. Gdi is a little goat. So a lot of people say, oh, it's only goats. I mean, cows is fine. First of all, the Torah comes and explains the reason why it says goat. It means talking about all the animals, because if it would be talking about a lamb only by the word lamb, every time that the Torah is talking about a lamb, it says gdi izim. It doesn't say gdi. When Yitzchak wanted to bless Yaakov, he told him, go bring me gdi izim. When Yehuda, if you remember the story, when he went to Tamar and he gave her the ring and everything, when he sent his messenger to go get the collateral back, he said also, send her with gdi izim. When the Torah wants to talk about a lamb, it says the word gdi izim, a lamb that comes from a goat. Here it just says gdi. The Torah explains the reason why it says gdi is, first of all, it's including all the animals. Why gdi? Because if you put any other meat in milk, the milk will burn very fast. They wouldn't be cooking anything. The lamb doesn't need much of time to cook. It will cook in a few minutes, so can be cooked in milk. But nevertheless, when we're looking at the approach of Ramban that says it's cruel, okay, I understand when I'm cooking the meat in the dairy, that's the meat that the calf was supposed to drink. I understand the cruelty. Okay, check. One. But what's cruel about wearing a sweater? Is there cruelty on the wool here? Okay, so let's skip the wool for a second. Let's go one generation after the other, or one level after the other. When we're talking about the meat and the dairy, I understand. Next prohibition is not to put a donkey and a ox together to plow the land. Can you figure out the cruelty here? When there's a lot of cruelty here when you're putting an ox and a donkey together. Because an ox is strong, he goes fast, and the donkey is weak, he doesn't go fast. So it ends up that the donkey is being pulled after the ox. That's cruel. Besides the fact that an ox chews his cud. So what happens is when they stop to eat, first of all, the donkey eats much less than the ox. But when they continue walking, the ox chews its cud, so the donkey thinks there's food, and he's like, how come I didn't get any food? So he keeps looking for the food. That's cruelty. I know it sounds funny, but that's cruelty. That's fact. I mean, we don't realize that because we go to the shop and we get our vegetables. Go 200 years back when you had your own backyard, you had to work your own land. That's cruel when you're having a strong animal next to a not strong animal. One is like this one. That's cruelty. Okay. I understand. This is very clear what the Ramban says. And by the way, about the meat and about the donkey and the ox, that's not the Ramban. That's actually the Sefer HaChinuch that's talking about that. But nevertheless, I understand the cruelty. Good. But where's the cruelty here with the wool and linen? I didn't see any cruelty here. How are you explaining cruelty here? And same thing with the seeds. Okay. So before we continue the explanation about the rest, we have to understand why cruelty is a very big thing in the Torah. Because one might say, okay, what's the big deal? So let the donkey suffer a little bit. So he thinks there's food. So he's dragging after the ox. No, the Torah says, there's a story in the Midrash, that Moshe Rabbeinu was a shepherd. He used to work for Yitro, take care of his sheep, his lamb, his cattle. So the story is that one time Moshe Rabbeinu went out with the young sheep and the lambs, and one lamb ran away. So Moshe Rabbeinu ran after it, and he was very fast, the lamb, jumping from one rock to the other, and Moshe couldn't catch up. Eventually, Moshe caught up, and he saw the little lamb. He found like a little wellspring, and he was drinking water. So Moshe Rabbeinu was like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know you only wanted to drink water. Okay, the lamb drank the water. And Moshe Rabbeinu told him, I'm assuming now you're so tired, you're small, to come back, I'll carry you on my back. So Moshe Rabbeinu carried the little lamb on his back. And that's one of the famous stories that Hashem saw that and says, oh, if you care so much about a little lamb, you're going to be a good shepherd to my nation, and made him a leader. But from that story, we learn that the Torah is very particular about suffering of an animal, suffering of anything. But specifically here about an animal, the Torah is very particular that an animal should not suffer. So when the Ramban comes and says, oh, this is about cruelty, then we understand, yeah, the Torah doesn't want the animal to have any type of pain or discomfort. So I can understand the approach of the Ramban, not the mixing of the meat and the dairy, or the donkey and the ox, it's cruelty, I understand. Yeah, but what about the mixing of the wool and linen and the seeds together? There's no cruelty here. So from that we can understand that the problem is not the cruelty, the problem is the mixture. When you mix two things together. Cruelty will be explained well in the donkey and the ox and the meat and the dairy, but when we're learning in the same concept of the mixed variety, kilaim, then we have also seeds and wool and linen, then cruelty, that's not the main problem. The main problem will be what's called ta'arovet. Ta'arovet is the mixture of two things. So in order to understand what the Torah is trying to tell me, I'll share with you a quick story and then we can conclude that there was once a Jew lived in Poland, and his business, he had what is called in our generation a bar. It was pretty common at the time because there were merchants, they would go from city to city, they had to stay somewhere, the people had, it was a good business to have an inn. And in the inn, you need to feed the people, and like in our generation, men after a long day of work, they want to go and have a cup of beer. Okay, so this Jew, what did he do? There was a landlord who rented him the building, and there wasn't like in our generation that you pay a monthly rent, rather you would pay percentage of what you make. Once a year, I come to the landlord, I made X amount of money, pay the landlord 20%, 30%. In our generation, we have the IRS for that. But nevertheless, that was the deal, and everything was good, and the business was well. One year was a harsh winter, so the bar was full. Nobody wanted to be outside in the cold weather, and he would sell the drinks. And the problem was, everybody would buy the drinks like writing down what's called hakafa, not paying cash. I'll pay you at the end of the month. Nobody paid. It was a bad year for business. Nobody had money. He ended up giving out all the food and the drinks. Nobody paid. Now he has a problem. He has to pay the landlord. He doesn't know what to do. And the landlord starts knocking on the door. Give me the money. What about my money? And he says, I don't have money. He's going to the customers. I don't have money. What are you going to do? He doesn't know what to do. Situation becomes very bad. So he goes to a big rabbi in the generation. I don't know if it's directly he was his rabbi, but a very famous rabbi, Naftali Rufshitz, who was a great rabbi at the time. He goes to him. And he tells him the whole story. So the Rebbe tells him, what's going to happen if you don't pay? So he says, well, he's going to take his whip off the wall and start whipping me and beating me up. So Naftali Rufshitz says, no, that's not a good thing. No, don't do that. Don't go back to the landlord. He says, that's not an answer. What kind of an answer that? I need an actual answer. Okay, he decides to go to a different tzaddik. He goes to another great Rebbe of the generation, Rabbi Menachem Mendel from Rimnov. These are known names for great rabbis. And he goes to him, tells him the exact same story. So the Rebbe tells him, what is going to happen if you don't pay? He says, he's going to take the whip off his wall and start beating me up. So he says, okay, you know what? It's not that bad. Nobody died from some beating. Go to him, get your beating. Okay. So he says, okay, no other option. He goes to the landlord. Where's my money? I don't have the money. What do you mean you don't have the money? Well, business was slow. Nobody paid. I don't have the money. Sure enough, the landlord takes the whip off the wall, starts beating him up. The guy's like lying on the floor in a puddle of blood. Suddenly the landlord says, whoa. The landlord suddenly gets his act together and says, what am I doing? For years you were a good tenant. You always pay. Okay, 1 year you didn't make. I'm so sorry. He apologized. I take it all back. Wipes his blood off. I apologize for beating you up. I feel so bad now that I did that. You were always such a good tenant. For years you always paid. You know what? Not only that I forgive you for the debt of this year, I'm giving you now free for another 2 years the whole place. Go make money. I'm sorry. Okay. He goes now back to Rabbi Menachem Mendel from Rimnov with all his bruises and his cuts. And he tells them, don't ask. He forgave me. I don't have to pay the debt. And not only that, I got 2 years free rent. How did you know? So Reb Menachem Mendel from Rimnov told him, don't you think that also Naftali Rufshitz knew what I knew? Just that he is a very merciful individual. And Reb Naftali Rufshitz, he's rooted in this sphere of chesed, of kindness. He didn't want you to get beaten up. But I'm rooted in the sphere of gvura. And I saw, okay, what's the big deal? So you'll get a few slaps to your face, but the debt will be removed and you'll get a free rent. So I saw the exact same things. I come from gvura, severity, and he comes from chesed, and each one operates in a completely different way. Which we can see in any situation, that the world is driven from these two powers, chesed and gvura. Some people are rooted in the sphera of chesed, kindness. They're kind, they do a lot of charity, they're soft-spoken, helping other people and so forth. Some people come from the side of gvura. They talk loud, they're severe, their decisions are strict, their entire disposition, their entire behavior is coming from the side of gvura. That doesn't mean one is better than the other. That's where you're rooted from. And we see it on ourselves. Some people are rooted in chesed and some people are rooted in gvura. Saying in other words that chesed and gvura exists in everything, not only in humans. It's in animals and it's in vegetation, it's in inanimates. These are two powers. Hashem created the world with 10 powers, Eser Sfirot. The two main ones is chesed and gvura. These are the ones that really drive the entire world, and we see it in everything. Some animals, you see how they're rooted in gvura. They're aggressive, they're strong. Some animals, you see how they're rooted in chesed. They're soft, they're kind, and they're friendly. And it's everything. It's not only in humans. It's two powers that kind of drive and the main power of this entire world. So when we see these specific prohibitions, then we can learn where they're coming from. If you're looking at meat and the dairy, meat is red. I'm not talking about chicken right now, I'm talking about meat from a cow. It's red. If you remember, I gave a class a few years ago about the root of colors in the sfirot. And we explained that red comes from the sphira of gvura. The color of milk is white. And the root of it, of the color white, is in the sphira of chesed. And when you're looking at the actual meat is like a mutzak. It's one piece. It's a one piece of meat. Milk is liquid. Two different things completely. So when we're mixing the meat and the dairy, we're mixing the gvura and the chesed together. Two different things. We're just mixing them together. And that you can find in everything. You can find also in the wool and the linen. Wool is white, and the linen is red. Same thing. The root of it is coming from two different places. And the same thing in the donkey and the ox. Oxes, you see clearly how the ox is rooted in gvura. Strong, angry, powerful. And the donkey is coming from the side of chesed. You ever saw an angry donkey? They're usually quiet, and they're kind, and they're soft, and the two different animals that are rooted from two different places, chesed and gvura. Saying in other words, but you can understand that these examples that the Torah chose, meat and dairy, an ox and a donkey, wool and linen, you see from the examples that the problem of the Torah is what's called nigudim, contrasts, two different things. The Torah uses the word nigudim vehipuchim. Nigud is like a contrast, or hipuch is a contrast, and nigud is like two whole different things. So really what the Torah is trying to tell us, the problem here is not necessarily with the fact, like we were saying with the meat and dairy, putting it together, it's the mixing of the two things. And when we're looking at the examples that the Torah chose, that we see that it's two total different things. You know, when we're looking at shatnez, at wool and linen, the Torah says that the first time that wool and linen met created the first murder. Because Cain and Hevel, Cain, he brought wool and Hevel brought linen as their offering. And since Hevel was, the other way around. Cain brought the linen and Hevel brought the wool. And Cain got jealous. Anyway, I'm not going to dissect now the whole thing, but he ended up killing him. Our sages say the first time that wool and linen came together, a murder came out of it, disaster. So, saying in other words, when we're focusing on this mixed variety, kilaim, is every creation has a purpose in this world. Whether it's a human, an animal, even something inanimate, everything has a purpose in this world. So much more so when it comes to a human. And the Torah is coming and telling me when you mix them together, two things that have two separate purposes, it will bring a disaster. A complete disaster. Why? Because when you put them together, they're nullifying the power of each other. Or one will overpower the other and will nullify the power of the weaker one. And then you're taking away its purpose from this world. Therefore, the Torah looks at it as a complete disaster. So the problem here is the mixture. If we're going back to what we explained in the meat and the dairy, it's not the cruelty. Yeah, okay, that also makes a lot of sense. That's why the Torah is constantly talking about, when it's talking about the meat and the dairy, is the cooking. Because if you put the piece of cheese and the piece of turkey together, you didn't cook. You just mix them together. Our sages said, okay, don't mix them for many different reasons right now. But nevertheless, the problem is the cooking, because when you cook something, it gets mixed together. This is called ta'arovet, a mixture. So this whole thing boils down to when you mix two things together. And the Torah comes and tells you what are the things that you can mix and things that you cannot mix. Saying in other words, when you mix something that is not supposed to be mixed, you create a complete disaster. Why? Because if everything has a purpose, and now I'm nullifying the power of the purpose, then I took away the purpose from whether it's the animal, the human, whatever it is, and that will create a disaster. So the Torah is coming and telling me behind this unclear message, what do I need to understand from this prohibition? I need to understand two things. First of all, is not to connect myself to an individual that will take away from myself my own power. And again, not to put myself in connection with a certain individual that will overpower me and I would lose my individuality. And then I lose my own purpose. And many times people are weak. They want to be connected to a certain individual because for whatever reason. But if I'm losing my own individuality, then I lost my purpose. More than that, that's not so easy to do. You need to think about that now for the next couple of days and how do I actually do that. But another amazing message that one can take is that we're all different. And yeah, it could be that you coming from the side of Chesed and I'm coming from the side of Gvura. We might not agree about certain things. The reality is that most people don't agree about certain things, about almost everything. Now, when it comes to certain things, I can understand. Then you don't want to agree when there's not to agree here. But in many of the cases, and I'm not going to give too many examples, but certain things, yeah, if somebody comes and explains something that has no common sense, or it's a danger to my life, or is going against the Torah, okay, you don't have to agree with the person. But in many of the cases, let's say, just take an example within the Torah. How many groups in the Torah there are that one will say like this and the other one will say like that? Who's more right now? And that's nothing to do right now with who's more right. We find in the Torah many different approaches. And when you go out from the world of the Torah, there's many other examples that I might not agree with you, but it doesn't mean that you are wrong. So first of all, I have to understand that I shouldn't associate or put myself in situations where I'm going to lose for myself. And I'll give you one example of many, just so you can go and develop it for yourself. I'm observant right now, I became observant 20 years ago. I'm going now to a family affair. So suddenly if I go to a family affair and my family is not observant, I don't need to eat kosher anymore. I can now mix the women and the men together. No, I'm observant. I don't change myself. When I'm going now to a family affair, I'm observant. Give me the kosher food. Give me the, if it doesn't fit my beliefs, I'm sorry, I can't participate. I cannot change myself now to cater other people's needs. That what would be the result? That I lose my individuality, that I lose my own image for you. Now in some cases, if I don't lose out of it, that's a whole different thing. But I have to make a quick analysis. If I now want to bring somebody closer to the Torah, right? Very noble for me. I want to go now and do outreach, kiruv, call it however you want. I want to bring somebody close to the Torah. Am I allowed to go now to a discotheque where the women are half naked there, dancing all together, pritzut, and because I want to come to put tefillin on somebody? What is that one going to do with that? Now, if somehow I would be able to do that, but there's more danger of me now living my image to fit, because I don't want to be standing out. I want to fit with that group. But if that group will take away from who I am, and I lose my own self, then you can't do that. And again, this is one example out of many. You need to develop the message. How can I not associate in a certain situation that I'm going to lose for myself? I'm not allowed now, if my daily routine is to pray 3 times a day, and I have to go somewhere now, and because of that it will cause me not to pray 3 times a day, I'm not allowed to associate in such a crowd. Doesn't matter if it's business, family, a vacation. That's who I am. I cannot be removed from who I am. If something else is going to overpower me, then I'm going to lose my own selfness, and by that I'm going to lose and not fulfill my purpose. Then the Torah tells me you're not allowed to do that. You can't mix with the wrong crowd. And again, I can give you 1,000 examples. When I lived in America, I had neighbors that are not Jewish. Good people, we were friends with them. Can I go and celebrate their holidays with them? No, I can't. As much, and then you know how many invitations I got. We're celebrating this party, Xmas party, whatever. Somebody, good friends of ours that are not Jews, invited us to a church for some, I don't even know how it's called, the baptizing of the child. They said, listen, I'll buy you a present, I'll give you good wishes. I'm not going to go into the church right now and mingle. It has nothing to do with me. And if chas v'shalom, maybe I'm going to be strong like a rock. But if chas v'shalom, there's a chance that because of me wanting to fit in the environment, I will now behave in a way that will be a misconduct to me, or will take away from my faith. I'm not allowed to do that. I respect you, I honor you, you're a friend of mine, you're my neighbor, but I can't mix with you if there's a danger that I'm going to lose for myself. And again, I'm trying to give you as much as examples that you can take it and say, okay, how can I do that in my life? Many people, they have family that they're not observant because they became observant. Many people converted, their family is not Jewish. And in many cases, sometimes it's a job. Sometimes it's a job. You're the only Haredi, the only religious Jew there. And everybody else is not. This is pretty common in Israel. So you have to understand that the message of Torah is telling me you cannot be overpowered by something else that you lose yourself completely. That's a mix. There's no mix there. But more beautiful, the Torah comes and tells you, but, besides don't mix, that's one thing. But don't remove yourself from not learning from another individual. Because in many cases I have my own approach, and I don't agree with your approach, but it doesn't mean that I can't learn from you. I might not agree with you. And again, I'm not talking about now the vaccines. That's... I knew you're all looking at me like, is this also including vaccines? So, talking about how you live your life and many other things. You need to know when to make the separation. In some things, no, I don't agree with you and I'll never agree with you. I don't want to hear what you have to say. But in many of the cases, I don't necessarily agree with you. It can be with the education of your kids, could be how you conduct your life, how you deal with your customers. I don't know. You have to come up with your own ideas. But I don't have to agree with you necessarily, but that should not stop me from learning from you. You know, even from our enemies we can learn many things. There are many quotes in Chazal how we can learn something positive from somebody negative. How many times our sages quote how we can learn a lot from animals. Now, I'm not an animal, but you can still learn a lot from an animal. You can learn how to be diligent from an ant and to be clean and modest from a cat. And there are so many Ma'amarei Chazal telling us, it doesn't mean you might not agree with somebody or somebody might be wicked or evil, but you can still learn something good. And I'm going to the extreme, it's from somebody evil. It can be from a friend that I might not agree with your way of life, but nevertheless, I can still learn from something that is a complete contrast for me. So when we're looking at this prohibition that on the surface seems very unclear or very unsettling or very unsatisfying, the Torah comes and says there are much more deeper things to learn from it. And the Torah is coming and giving me, when two things are complete opposites, don't put them together. Don't put them together in a way that they're getting mixed with each other. If they're not mixed with each other, that's fine. Let them be separate. That's how the world is created. Hashem created everything with a polarity. Right from the beginning. There's going to be an evening and there's going to be a day. There's going to be a light, there's going to be darkness. There's good and there's bad. There's kosher and unkosher. Permitted and not permitted. Everything in this world has a polarity. It's called leumat zeh. That's how Hashem created the world. But also in the powers that control the world, Chesed and Gvura, some are associated or rooted in Chesed, some are associated and rooted in Gvura. It doesn't mean that you're better than me or I'm better than you. It doesn't mean necessarily that we can fit together, but I can learn from you, I can respect you, and when it's time not to associate or not to mingle or not to mix, then I know when it's time not to mix. Mezad Hashem, this is a very good lesson now, especially in the month of Elul, to understand that I first of all have to stand for my own beliefs and not to get affected by the opinions of others that might contradict with what I think, but nevertheless also to make room for others and make it and understand that I can learn from others and so forth, and to understand that Hashem creates in the world in a certain way, and I need to know where is my place, where not to associate, where I have to associate, where I need to stay away, where not. But Be'ezrat Hashem, we can take this beautiful message from the Torah and to know when to prevent chas v'shalom a disaster, and when it's time to bring the unity together, then it has to be done in the right way. Not everything can be united, and not everything every time it's the right time. Everything has the time and the place. But Be'ezrat Hashem, from that small message we can take to our life and apply it, and Be'ezrat Hashem make us a much better individual, serve Hashem in a much better way, and see the ultimate blessing in our life. Be'ezrat Hashem, Hashem should bless us all with all the good and kind blessing that He has.